Hi, I'm Matthew Hall, and my new book, The Black Art of Killing, is published on April the 2nd.
My name is Gregg Hurwitz. I'm the author of the Orphan X series. The newest is called Into the Fire.
Greg, I'm really interested in how you became a writer. You know, I often think that writing is something that chooses you, that it's not something you actively choose to do. Was that your experience?
Yeah, I think there's a way that our brains are wired to tell stories. My parents did not let me watch telly when I was growing up, which was an outrage. Except if the Red Sox game was on, because my dad's from Boston and that's religion, or if there was a Hitchcock movie on. So, I always say if you add bourbon, that explains like 90% of my personality between the Red Sox, Hitchcock, and bourbon. So I grew up reading. I went to the library all the time. I must have read 10, 12 books a week growing up. And it's funny because my sister was an equally fanatical reader, and I had a conversation with her one day. I said, well, when are you going to start your first book? I just assumed that everybody who loved reading, that the natural progression was you become a writer. I always thought in stories. And I wrote my first mystery. I must have been 10. I illustrated it with crayons. Willie, Julie, in the case of the buried treasure. You're probably familiar with it. And so, when I went off to university, I studied English and psychology, and I just started my first book at 19. I mean, it was the only thing I was ever going to do.
Okay, so did you go straight from studying into writing?
Yeah, I came over here to study. I have a master's in Shakespearean tragedy. I needed a highly practical degree to enter the job force, and I thought that should really have them kicking down my door. But it was a stall for me to rewrite this really bad first draft of my first book, which was called The Tower. And I got really fortunate, and I think I was too young and too dumb to think that I couldn't do it. So.
Oh, that's great. So did you literally get a writing career going immediately from your studies onwards?
I did. It was kind of, I came out ostensibly to get the master's in Shakespearean tragedy, but I was drinking pints, I was playing football, and I was finishing this, in hindsight, not very good rough draft. And I got an agent, and then I did about 16 drafts more over the course of months. He put me through it, and then we sold it to Simon & Schuster.
That's terrific. I'm quite jealous of that because I grew up in quite a creative family. It was quite a disrupted upbringing in many ways, and so I got the idea in my head that I needed a proper job, a proper career, actually quite a conservative career. So I studied down the road from you, actually in Worcester College in Oxford, did law, and got myself into a barrister's.
That's why you're better dressed than me.
Well, I live out in the country. Normally I'm wearing overalls and boots or something like that.
That would have put me more at ease.
This is my London gear. Comes on once a year. So I got myself a place as a barrister, and I tried to do the law for a few years, but it just really didn't make me happy.
That's so interesting. So you said you're from a creative family.
Yeah.
What did everyone do? What were their professions?
My father's a classical musician.
Really?
My mother is a writer, non-fiction, and she's written fiction and plays. And my stepfather's a writer. Yeah.
So you grew up kind of craving the straight and narrow in a way.
Yeah, I did. I ran away to the most conservative profession I could possibly find.
That's so funny. See, I'm from a family of all doctors and lawyers. And I hadn't met anyone who made a living doing anything creative.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah.
And so it was the exact opposite almost. I felt like I was, arrived at Earth somehow from some alien land and just had no idea. I was writing my way towards it. When my first book came out, they said you have to get blurbs from other authors, and I'd never met one. I mean, it was before, now everyone has access with Twitter and the internet and all these conferences people go to. I didn't know a single person. And my lawyer repped a wonderful writer called Peter Hedges, who wrote What's Eating Gilbert Grape. He writes these beautiful dramas. And he and I were laughing about this the other day. So that was my first blurb about my book. My first book was like an underwater prison with a serial killer escape. And it was from the author of What's Eating Gilbert Grape. The blurb was totally inappropriate, but I didn't know a single person.
Yeah, it's strange. I had the opposite problem. And my stepfather's really quite a well-known television writer. So it was actually almost impossible for me to kind of forge a separate identity, I think. So it took me a while, but...
Does he write in the same genre?
Fairly similar genre, yeah.
Really?
But obviously we're not related by birth, but we kind of think in a fairly similar...
But you grew up in a house where at least you thought you understood something that was possible.
Yeah. But I've always felt guilty about being a writer, about not having a proper job every day. It's quite interesting.
Where did you get that, though? Because no one gave that to you in your family. Was that just part of your own identity that you were carving out?
Yeah, I think maybe that's what it is, yeah. I think it's taken me till my kind of late 40s, 50-odd, to actually feel, I'm absolutely comfortable being a writer and nothing else. It's quite interesting.
So your self-definition early meant that you were going to be different and more traditional and responsible. And
that's right. So I actually think it took me far longer to unlearn the law than it did to learn it in the first place, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I feel that's in the past now. Look, we both written thrillers with quite unorthodox central characters in a way, and I just want to talk a bit about those and figure out where they came from. You're Evan Smoke. I've read 3 of your books now, and he's Orphan X. He was plucked from an orphanage, age 12, and turned into a government assassin. Where did that idea come from?
Well, like you, I have a lot of friends from the Spec Ops community, SEALs and Green Berets, and I do a lot of research. I have a really weird Rolodex. It's like professors and porn stars and snipers and demolition breachers and all the research that I've pulled in over the course of writing the books. And they always talked about these deep black programs or deep black missions and how they're funded and where they came from. And so I was very interested in that because it happens a lot, that there's things going on that no one knows. And then I just thought, well, what if it was a situation where they were taking kids out and training them up, but these kids who they think no one wants, who are basically disposable weapons. And so I had that notion first, but then I really I was kind of afraid to write the first Orphan X because I wanted to do something different that I felt could have the chance to earn a spot in the pantheon with Reacher and Bond and Bourne. There's so many figures to live up to. And one of the things, and I didn't just want to write where, it was horrible and he became this hardened assassin. And I thought, what if the man who pulls him out, who's his handler, becomes his father figure and actually loves him? And what if that process, as awful as it is for him to have that upbringing and have to deal with that, what if it's also the best thing that ever happened to him? Because it saved his life in a manner, and it opened him up to the world. And there's a key line for me in Orphan X around which the whole series coalesces, and it's when Jack Johns, who's his handler and father figure, says to him at 12, the hard part won't be making you a killer, the hard part is keeping you human. And if he'd made him a killer, he would have been a true believer and things would have been easier for him, but they're not. And so he's always had this fragmented, overlap between his morality. And it's one of the reasons why I made a choice to set him in the real world where you and I live. We don't see James Bond go home. We don't see Jason Bourne have an awkward encounter in the elevator with a judgmental elderly Jewish woman who may or may not be based on my grandma. And trying to figure out the small talk, trying to figure out what is this strange language of intimacy. And he wants to. He's not just Shane that he's riding off into the sunset.
Yeah, this is interesting. So we've got broadly similar thought processes going on. My central character, Leo Black, was in the SAS for 20 years. He's been through the real world experiences and through the wars that we all know about. And when we meet him, he's trying to put that world behind him and become an academic in Oxford University. He wants to be a historian, and he wants to improve the way that wars are fought and conflicts conducted. So he's having really quite a serious thought process about what he's done wrong in his life and how he can correct it. But then he gets drawn back in by his former commanding officer who's doing something shady and grey for the government.
It's interesting that sort of mirrors your biography in a manner, that he has this wild, reckless, creative job, and he goes to university.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, it's quite interesting.
And he's trying to be in university, and then he gets drawn back to the thing that's the point of his genesis. So that's
right, but there's a duality in his character, which there is in Evan Smoke. So on the one hand, he's a man who can be very violent, but he contains that. He doesn't revel in it. But on the other hand, he's quite thoughtful. And there's this domestic element to it, because I wanted to get very, very close to him and intimate with him. And you do that with Evan Smoke. And that's something that I think that we're doing that in storytelling generally. I'm thinking about the big TV shows like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. We want to see the reality, the domesticity of these figures, these mythological figures that we're creating. Do you think there's an element of that?
I think it's an element as the audience and readership gets more pop culture aware, which they are now very differently. I think that what we want to do is see some of these archetypal stories shown in a different light. So the brilliance of The Sopranos is opening, with him in therapy. It's dissecting him as a real person. It's unlike The Godfather, right? It's unlike The Untouchables. It's unlike any of these stories we've had. I think that part of it is we want to come in and play with stories we're familiar with and hit them from different angles. And so for me, we know these archetypes and we know these characters, and I'm always thinking, how can I dissect them and undercut them? Like, to give you an example, the cast of characters around Evan, one of them is Joey, who's Josephine Morales, who's this young, she's 16-year-old hacker. She's quite brilliant. She's quite teen. She's mouthy. She's amazing. But she really undercuts him a lot. I mean, they have a lot of banter, and she makes fun of him, and she makes fun of the Nowhere Man conventions when Evan answers the phone and says, "Do you need my help?" Like, she makes fun of his tone, and you don't see that often. People don't make fun of James Bond, right? People don't make fun of Bourne and undercut him. And there's another character, Tommy Stojak, based on a friend of mine who's he passed away. He's a brilliant armorer and world-class sniper. And he's a better shooter than Evan, right? Pure shooter. So he's always making fun of Evan so Evan goes around and he's always dealing with subject matter experts who are better at this one thing than he is. And so it's different in some ways that everyone's not looking up to him necessarily like Ethan Hunt, though they do, but it's grudging. It's more like relationships in the real world where everyone's constantly taking the piss.
Okay, so both our characters are killers. They're trained killers, right? So we're going to quite dark places with them. I've often thought, why are we telling these stories? Are we trying to explore our own shadow sides? Are we inviting the audience to explore their own shadow sides through these characters? So are we finding new ways of doing it with these characters by giving them, by planting them more in the domestic realm? Are we bringing that shadow side closer to readers?
Yeah, well, look, I think that if you look at what a hero's journey is, and we write more protagonists than heroes, right? They're complicated.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean, really, the hero's journey is teaching us as you read it how to deal with the unknown externally and internally. So, the normal answer when people say, why do people read thrillers? We say, oh, well, it brings chaos, it brings order from chaos, and we don't have order in the real world. But it's not really just that. It's the fact that when someone goes on a mission and confronts a part of themselves, the same rules hold for our own psychological development. So just like, as you and I were talking about, I was observing in you the pattern of your character professionally has some mirrors in your personal life. I mean, I just realized 6 months ago maybe the unbelievable amount of overlaps between Orphan X and how he's developing over the books and all the things I'm dealing with and my whole history. It's all tangled up in that. It's the same thing. And if you think about the archetypal hero myth, everyone's holed up in a castle and they're terrified and the dragon's coming eating everyone, and the hero's the one who says, who voluntarily will go on the mission that will kill him, right?
Yeah.
So you have to volunteer for it. You have to be willing to go through hell, like every hero's journey has a journey to hell. You confront the thing that will devour you. It's usually a dragon, and what's the dragon always guard?
The treasure.
Treasure. And so why does that make any sense? Like a dragon, what good does a dragon have for amount of treasure? And the treasure, I think, represents your self-awareness if you can confront and live. People don't always live when they go into the darkest place within themselves. They die to suicide or addiction or they withdraw. But you kill the dragon, you get the gold, and then the last part is you come back to society again. And that's what our stories are in some ways.
Yeah.
Like Beowulf comes back with Grendel's paw, right? He nails it over the mantle. And so a story is Grendel's paw on the mantle. It's trying to say, hey, here's something that I learned and figured out. And if you think about the parallel, let's say there's something you're afraid of, or you're a parent and your kids has something that they're afraid of. You don't hole up and hide from it in the castle because it'll just devour everything around you, then it'll devour you. You have to face it. That's the Freudian cathartic technique, right?
Yeah.
That's how we parent. That's what we need to do. That's if there's an unspoken friction in an intimate relationship. You don't hide from it or it'll take over everything. You have to face it even if it might kill you and even if you think it's the thing you can least possibly face. And so I think as we're writing this and putting these into external form, we're learning about ourselves a little bit and we're pushing them into some version that I think readers can look at the way we read other people's works. And it's our training for how do you walk a line that has virtue and courage?
I think that's right. I think what you're talking about is this sort of Jungian journey of individuation, that the truth lies in the place that you least want to go and look for it.
Yeah, and the whole second half of his career, he wrote only about alchemy, which seems insane. But you think about alchemy's turning base metal into gold. And everything of value in all those alchemical equations, it's like the jewel in the toad's head. It's the treasure with the dragon. It's the thing of the most value is the place you least want to look. So that's therapy.
Yeah,
it's all the same thing, right?
Yeah, this book that I've just written is an interesting one for me because I've been writing for the last 10 years mostly female protagonists, both in television and in fiction, which is quite a strange thing in some ways. Why am I expressing myself through female characters? And then I had this overwhelming urge. I wanted to write the most manly, masculine character that I could conjure, and along comes Leo Black. So I've gone to a completely different.
Why do you think you were writing female protagonists first?
I was writing about a coroner, so a woman who deals with death and the intimate emotions surrounding that. And I tried to write a male character, and I was making him quite sensitive, and that just wasn't chiming. So I wanted a really empathetic, sympathetic, emotional character, and I found that it was much better expressed through a woman than through a man. And to my great surprise, a lot of women write to me saying, "Wow, I didn't know that you're a man writing a female character."
That's pretty flattering.
Which is quite interesting, yeah. But then, I started reading Jung a few years ago, and I thought, well, actually, we're all an amalgam of male and female characteristics. So we're just exploring these different avenues in our writing. It strikes me that Evan Smoke is sort of part of this American tradition of the very self-reliant character. He's really kind of alone, and he lives on his wits, quite separate from society. And to me, that feels like an inheritance of all those cowboys.
All the westerns?
Do you think
I think
there's
of
an
him
element of that?
as being, he's outside of society because of this upbringing in his past. He has a lot of chemistry with, there's a single mother district attorney who lives downstairs from him, and they have a lot of chemistry, but if she ever knew what he really was, she would have to arrest him. And so he's always on the outskirts. I picture him as having his face up to the glass, and he's looking in at all these people leading the types of ordinary lives that he himself can never have. But at least if he can protect them, right? If people in desperate straits can call him, he's got a phone number, and he basically will help them if they have nowhere else to turn. And at least he can preserve that for them, even if he can never have it himself. But one of the things that's happened over the course of the books is he's kind of forged his way into understanding, the strange language of intimacy. And so Joey, she was supposed to die at the end of Hellbent. And I got to it, and there was too much she was bringing out in him. It was
you couldn't kill her off.
Yeah, I tried, but I couldn't.
No.
And so he's building, there's more people and more interactions. And so Into the Fire finds him with more types of interfaces that bring out more reflections of himself than maybe were in Orphan X or The Nowhere Man, where he was kind of coming out of his shell of being more alone. So he's emerging in a way that's interesting, and I don't think we often see as clearly.
No, I've seen that development, that character development in him over the books. But what you've got in America, you've got a freedom, you've got a kind of mythological landscape. America's big, and it feels like anything's possible there, and people ride around with guns, so it gives you all of that sort of potential. We're a much smaller country and a kind of older culture in a way. And I think that makes for slightly different heroes. So our heroes have got to be sort of insiders to a certain extent, but mavericks. So they've
James Bond.
Yeah. And I realised that, creating Leo Black, he had to have come from the SAS. He had to have been licensed in his activity.
Right. He was sanctioned at one point.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that comes from the myth of America is really Emersonian, and it's on self-reliance. I mean, Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, he says, to know what is true in your own heart of hearts, that's true for all mankind, that is genius. And we're founded on this principle of individualism, right? It's like, it's the Bill of Rights. It's founded on distinction from the traditions and organizations and of Britain. I mean, so it's a quite clearly stated you know.
But it's those expressions of individualism that the British and the Europeans find hardest to understand.
Right.
It's like gun ownership. It's like not having a national health service. It's those things.
Right.
I can understand entirely why they're so attractive to Americans, because it's like, I'm standing on my own 2 feet, and this is a great journey through life. But do you think that's changing? I mean, it seems that the battle lines are being drawn up in America between that old way of doing things and a more European model.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's happening here too, right?
Yeah.
Conservatives and liberals have different worldviews, and until we can figure out the necessity, I think that a society that functions well is if there's a healthy representation of both working together. That's what holds society in balance. So if all of societies, you think about your own background, and it's not surprising to me that you come from this interesting different background. You went into the law, you're writing these books that are very mavericky, but you started writing, you've also, like, your whole life is trying to pull these opposites into contention, female character to male character, bohemian lifestyle versus barrister. And those things are important. It's important to embody both and give them their due and understand them in full, because that's how you can craft a character like Leo Black, who's going to have more complexity and well-roundedness than if you just were writing the hard-charging, hyper-masculine. Yeah. If that's where you came from, and if that's the lane you were on your whole life, you wouldn't be able to write a character with that kind of depth. And it's a very similar thing to how society functions, because if we go all the way one way or another, or worse, if we continue to vilify the opposite side and keep double downing that the polarization is going outward till both sides look at the other's most unreasonable positions and dismiss them, you can't get anywhere. And so America's undergoing something that's not dissimilar, I think, to what's happening here, and that the loudest voices are on the extremes, even if that's not where the bulk of the country has sort of a commonsensical notion that there is room for more kinds of views, and there's a reasonable common ground that can be met that's also in keeping with our national character.
Yeah, I'm quite optimistic because I think most people actually want to have detailed conversations.
I wrote a book that takes place in mind control cults, and I went undercover into mind control cults to research. Okay. And one of the things that's very interesting, one of the ways they function is through a psychological concept called pluralistic ignorance, where everybody is miserable and afraid, but they won't speak out. And I think we see that a lot, double downing in politics in the social arena, is if the voices are the most strident in the extremes and you say something people disagree with, a lot of people might agree and want to come out, but they're afraid. You see it in North Korea, like everyone's miserable, but they can't break this frame. And so I think it's a more important time ever for heroes who act on their own and act with complexity and aren't sure-minded, and it's not propaganda and just filling in the blanks of a story where everything's figured out in advance.
Yeah, I think that, I've got a really strong feeling that in fiction we have to start trying to unify these opposites that are going on in society, and I realise that's what I'm kind of trying to do with Leo Black, because I read, where the book started, I read a quote from George Orwell a number of years ago, and it was something like this: people sleep peaceably in their beds at night because rough men stand ready to do violence on their behalf. And I thought that was really interesting. And at the time, my son was at Oxford University, and he was editing the paper there. And all the issues were around sort of microaggressions, no platforming speakers with whom some of the students didn't agree with. And I thought these are really sort of very neurotic issues that are going on in the heart of the educational establishment. And I thought, well, what if I took the kind of roughest guy, the meanest former soldier that I could conjure, and slammed him together with that sort of sensitive heart of our intellectual establishment, and what would happen?
And what do both have to say that's valid? Because it's easy to pick out one example of some ridiculous microaggression that everyone can make fun of, but part of that voice that's coming, and I've been thinking about this a lot in America, there's a voice that's saying, look, if you want to run everything and you want to do everything, you better take better care of those who don't have power. That's what underlies this, right? So you can pick out one thing and then get outraged at how silly it is from either side, but it's complicated, and you have to really try to figure out how to listen with earnestness.
Well, that's right. You've got to get underneath the noise and try and find what people are getting at. And these young people are trying to find a new system of ethics. That's what they're genuinely trying to do.
But it is
find strange
interesting if
expression.
you're finding ways to reconcile that with,
That's right.
the old guard and some of the
Yeah.
some of the realities of violence and of necessity. That's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, because no matter how liberal and caring our society becomes, we're still fascinated by these violent characters. So we have to incorporate that in our consciousness.
Hey, look, it's been a pleasure talking with you about this. It's certainly fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can feed currents from our own lives and currents from culture and currents from politics and to the characters. But at the end of the day, one of the things I found is that the story has to come from the story. So it can have reflections of all this, but I'm not writing to a political end. I'm not writing where I figured out the answers ahead of time, because then it's propaganda, it's not narrative.
Oh, absolutely. I entirely agree with that. I mean, what happens as a writer is you sort of get overtaken, almost slightly possessed by a character, and they come with their story. And I find the process of writing is sort of allowing oneself to let that story come through you. So I'm in a sense, I don't feel that I'm creating the story myself. I feel like I'm
chasing it.
Chasing it, yeah.
Well, thank
absolutely.
you for taking the time to talk with me.
Hey, nice to meet you, Greg.
You too.
Cheers.